Stanley stood at the edge of the forest, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The sun was setting behind him, casting long shadows that stretched into the dense underbrush ahead. The deep forest was a place of legend in the small town of Coldwater, and not the good kind. Stories circulated of those who ventured in, but never returned, of whispers that followed you, and of eyes that seemed to watch from the darkness. He wasn't here by choice. His older brother Tom had gone missing 2 days ago. The authorities had found his car abandoned near the forest entrance, and despite extensive search efforts, there had been no sign of him since. Stanley knew his brother well. Tom wouldn't just disappear without a trace. Something had happened in those woods, and Stanley was determined to find out what. He checked his gear one last time. A flashlight with spare batteries, a map of the area, a compass, and a knife. His phone had a weak signal, but he hoped it would be enough to call for help if needed. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the forest, the underbrush crunching underfoot as he moved deeper into the darkness. The air grew cooler as the canopy thickened above him, blocking out the last remnants of daylight. Stanley kept a steady pace, following the rough trail Tom's footprints had made. He noted every broken branch, every disturbed patch of earth, trying to piece together the direction his brother had gone. As he walked, the silence of the forest enveloped him. There were no birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to grow heavier with each step. His mind began to play tricks on him, shadows morphing into shapes and sounds echoing in the distance. He shook his head, focusing on the task at hand. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker. The beam of his flashlight cut through the blackness, illuminating the path ahead. He glanced at his map, trying to orient himself. According to the map, there was a small clearing up ahead where he could set up camp for the night. He pushed forward, eager to reach a safe spot before nightfall. The clearing was smaller than he had anticipated, barely enough space to lay out his sleeping bag. He gathered some wood for a small fire, hoping it would keep the creeping dread at bay. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He turned quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just more shadows and the flicker of his firelight. Stanley sat down by the fire, pulling out a small notebook. He had promised himself he would document everything, both for his own sanity and in case he needed to report back. He scribbled down notes about the trail, the eerie silence, and the feeling of being watched. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, but he forced himself to continue. Suddenly, a snap of a branch broke the silence. Stanley's head jerked up, and he grabbed his flashlight, pointing it towards the sound. The beam landed on a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. His heart pounded in his chest as he called out, "Tom, is that you?" The figure didn't move. Stanley took a tentative step forward, keeping the light trained on the shape. As he got closer, he could make out more details. It wasn't Tom. It was a woman, her clothes torn and dirty, her eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she turned and disappeared into the forest. Stanley hesitated for a moment, then followed. The underbrush clawed at his legs as he ran after her, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. He called out to her, but she didn't respond. She moved quickly, almost as if she knew the forest intimately. Stanley struggled to keep up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. After what felt like an eternity, he burst into another clearing. The woman was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he found himself standing before an old, dilapidated cabin. The windows were broken, and the door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. He approached cautiously, peering inside. The cabin was empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture and scattered debris. Stanley's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was thick with dust and decay, and he had to cover his mouth to keep from coughing. As he explored the cabin, he found more signs of recent activity. A makeshift bed in one corner, a few empty cans of food, and a map spread out on a table. He moved closer, studying the map. It was marked with various locations within the forest, some crossed out, others circled. One of the circled spots was labeled Cave. Stanley's heart raced as he traced the route to the cave. It wasn't far from the cabin, and he had a gut feeling that it was where he needed to go. He left the cabin and headed back into the forest, the night growing darker around him. The path to the cave was treacherous, the ground uneven, and the trees closing in on all sides. His flashlight flickered again, and he tapped it nervously, hoping it wouldn't die on him. Finally, he reached the entrance to the cave. It loomed before him, a gaping maw in the hillside. Stanley hesitated, his fear battling with his determination. He took a deep breath, then stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him whole. The cave's entrance narrowed quickly, forcing Stanley to crouch as he moved deeper into the darkness. The air grew cooler, and the smell of damp earth filled his nostrils. His flashlight flickered again, and he gave it another tap, the beam stabilizing for now. His heart pounded in his chest, echoing off the stone walls. As he ventured further, the cave widened into a larger chamber. The beam of his flashlight danced across the walls, revealing old carvings and strange symbols etched into the rock. Stanley couldn't decipher their meaning, but their presence unsettled him. He pressed on, following the path marked on the map he found in the cabin. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps. Suddenly, he heard a faint noise, a soft shuffling from deeper within the cave. He paused, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, his other hand resting on the knife at his belt. A figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling towards him. Stanley's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Tom. His brother looked disheveled and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. "Stanley?" Tom's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Tom, thank God I found you." Stanley rushed forward, pulling his brother into a tight embrace. "What happened? We need to get out of here." Tom shook his head, pulling away. "No, it's not safe. There's something in the cave. It's watching us." Stanley felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "We need to go now, before it's too late." Tom grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You don't understand. It's too late for me. But you can still escape. There's a passage further in it that leads to another exit. You have to go now." Stanley hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the need to help his brother. "I'm not leaving you here, Tom. We can make it out together." Before Tom could respond, a low guttural growl echoed through the cave. Stanley turned, shining his flashlight towards the sound. The beam caught a glimpse of something moving, something large and shadowy. His blood ran cold as the growl grew louder, closer. "Run!" Tom pushed him towards the passage. "Go, Stanley. I'll hold it off." Stanley's mind raced, but he knew he had no choice. He turned and sprinted down the passage, his flashlight flickering wildly. He could hear the creature behind him, its growls echoing off the walls. He glanced back once, seeing Tom standing his ground, a look of determination on his face. The passage twisted and turned, the walls closing in. Stanley's lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, but he kept running. The growls faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Finally, he saw a faint light ahead. He pushed himself harder, desperate to reach the exit. He burst out of the cave, collapsing on the forest floor. The first light of dawn was breaking through the trees, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Stanley lay there, gasping for breath, his mind reeling. He had found his brother, but at what cost? As he caught his breath, he realized the forest was no longer silent. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze. The oppressive weight that had hung over the deep forest was gone. Stanley stood looking back at the cave entrance. He knew he couldn't leave without making sure. He approached cautiously, calling out, "Tom." There was no response. He stepped inside, the darkness swallowing him once more. The cave was silent, empty. He moved deeper, retracing his steps to the chamber where he had found Tom. Stanley sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He had lost Tom, but he had to believe his brother's sacrifice wasn't in vain. He made his way back to the entrance, the morning sun warming his face as he emerged from the shadows. He took one last look at the forest, a place that held so many secrets and so much fear. He would return to Coldwater, share his story, and honor his brother's memory, but he knew that the deep forest would always be a part of him, a dark chapter in his life that he could never forget. As he walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace. The forest had taken so much from him, but it had also given him a chance to say goodbye, and that, he realized, was something worth holding on to. Oscar's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The dense forest loomed around him, a sea of dark green and shadows. He had been driving for hours, the narrow dirt road winding deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving him in a suffocating blanket of darkness, broken only by the faint glow of his headlights. He had never intended to come this far. It had been years since he last visited his family's old cabin, and the memories associated with it were buried deep within him, sealed away and forgotten. But a recent phone call had changed everything. His Uncle Richard had passed away, leaving Oscar as the sole inheritor of the isolated property. As the road narrowed even further, Oscar's heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and unease. The forest seemed to close in on him, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He could feel the weight of their gaze as if the forest itself was alive, watching his every move. Finally, the headlights caught the edge of the cabin, a dilapidated structure half swallowed by the encroaching forest. He parked the car and stepped out, the cool night air biting at his skin. The cabin looked even more decrepit than he remembered, the wooden planks weathered and warped, the windows opaque with grime. Oscar fumbled with the key, his fingers numb from the cold. The door creaked open, revealing the dim interior. The musty smell of decay and neglect assaulted his senses as he stepped inside. He flicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the dust-covered furniture and cobweb-draped corners. He made his way to the living room, where an old fireplace stood cold and empty. A faded portrait of his grandfather hung above the mantel, the eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. Oscar shivered, an irrational chill creeping up his spine. He had never liked that painting. As he began to unpack his belongings, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He chalked it up to nerves and the eerie atmosphere of the cabin. But as the night wore on, the sensation grew stronger, an almost palpable presence lurking just beyond the edges of the light. He tried to distract himself by exploring the cabin, rediscovering the remnants of his childhood summers. An old weather-beaten journal caught his eye, tucked away in a drawer. It belonged to his Uncle Richard. Curiosity piqued. Oscar sat down and began to read. The entries were mundane at first, detailing the day-to-day maintenance of the cabin and the surrounding property. But as he read on, the tone changed. Richard wrote about strange occurrences in the forest, unexplained noises, shadows moving in the darkness, a sense of being followed. Oscar's heart raced as he read the final entries. Richard had become obsessed with something in the forest, something he couldn't explain. He wrote of sleepless nights, haunted by the sound of whispers and footsteps outside the cabin. His last entry was a frantic scrawl, barely legible. "It's here. I can't escape." Oscar's flashlight flickered, and he felt a rush of cold air. The cabin seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening. He stood up, the journal slipping from his grasp. The sound of footsteps echoed outside, slow and deliberate. He held his breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. Oscar's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he couldn't move, rooted to the spot by a paralyzing fear. The doorknob rattled, and the door creaked open. Oscar's flashlight went out. Oscar stood frozen in the pitch black, his heart hammering in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he tried to turn on the flashlight app. A faint glow finally emanated from the screen, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. He pointed the light towards the door, half expecting to see some grotesque figure standing there. But the doorway was empty. He breathed a shaky sigh of relief, but the sense of unease remained, gnawing at his nerves. Gathering his courage, Oscar decided to investigate outside. He grabbed a lantern from the shelf, lit it with trembling hands, and stepped out into the night. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees standing like silent giants under the faint starlight. He walked around the perimeter of the cabin, the lantern casting a small pool of light. The night was deathly quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife eerily absent. He rounded the corner and froze. In the soft light of the lantern, he saw footprints in the mud, fresh, human footprints leading into the forest. Oscar's pulse quickened. He knew he should go back inside, lock the door, and wait for daylight. But something compelled him to follow the tracks. He needed to know what had terrified his uncle so much. He took a deep breath and started down the path, each step heavy with dread. The forest closed in around him, the trees seeming to lean closer as he walked. The footprints were clear, leading deeper and deeper into the woods. Oscar's mind raced with thoughts of what he might find. Was someone else living out here? Had his uncle been driven mad by isolation? Or was there truly something sinister lurking in these woods? After what felt like hours, he came to a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like twisted arms. At the base of the tree, something glinted in the lantern light. Oscar approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. It was a rusted old lockbox. He knelt down and inspected it, the metal cold and rough under his fingers. With some effort, he pried it open. Inside, he found a bundle of yellow papers, tied together with a faded ribbon. He pulled them out and began to read. The papers were a series of letters, dated decades ago. They told a chilling story of a hermit who had lived in these woods, a man who claimed to be haunted by spirits. He wrote of hearing whispers in the night, seeing figures in the trees, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The final letter was a desperate plea for help, the handwriting barely legible. "They are here. They won't let me leave." Oscar's blood ran cold. The similarities to his uncle's journal were too close to be a coincidence. He looked around the clearing, his mind racing. The footsteps, the sense of being watched, the overwhelming fear. It all pointed to something unnatural. A sudden rustling in the bushes made him jump. He spun around, the lantern swinging wildly. The light caught a glimpse of something moving, a shadow slipping between the trees. Oscar's heart pounded as he backed away, the letters clutched in his hand. He turned and ran, the forest a blur around him. Branches clawed at his clothes, roots threatened to trip him, but he didn't stop. He burst out of the woods and into the clearing around the cabin, his lungs burning and his legs trembling. Oscar slammed the door behind him, bolting it shut. He leaned against it, gasping for breath. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He felt the weight of the letters in his hand, a tangible connection to the terror that had plagued this place for generations. As he sat down, trying to calm his racing heart, the whispers began. Soft at first, just on the edge of hearing. He strained to listen, his eyes wide with fear. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and filled with sorrow. Oscar knew he had to leave. The cabin, the forest, everything about this place was tainted with a malevolent presence. He packed his things hurriedly, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. As he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap. The forest was alive with sound now, the whispers swirling around him, the trees seeming to close in. Oscar didn't look back as he got into his car and started the engine. He drove away, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind him. As the forest thinned and the road widened, the whispers faded. But Oscar knew he would never forget the terror of that night, the feeling of being watched, the sense of something ancient and malevolent lurking in the shadows. He vowed never to return to the deep forest, to leave the cabin and its haunting memories behind forever. But deep down, he knew the forest would always be with him, a dark shadow on the edge of his mind, whispering its secrets to him in the dead of night.